Shiva, April, welcome. So we're so lucky to have these two product stars with us today. Shiva was named Chief Product Officer of WeWork last summer, and April was named Chief Product Officer of Slack in April, actually, fittingly enough.
That's right.
And they worked together at Twitter many moons ago, so they have known each other before now. So before we started in the conversation, I just have to bring this up with Shiva. Are you going to eat meat on this trip?
Wow.
Does everyone know what I'm referring to?
Yeah.
WeWork said last week they're not going to expense meat on business trips, no meat in the company anywhere. We're having a big barbecue tonight. So we'll give you a doggy bag. We'll do whatever you need.
Thank you, everyone who texted me pictures last night. It made me very hungry. This is a complicated personal topic because I'm a Hindu that grew up in Texas. And the McRib was a key part of my assimilation strategy at the end of the day.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so, but ultimately, I'm very proud of what we're doing. Right? We're a very mission-oriented company. And at the end of the day, it's all about making real impact. So we got to, put our money where our mouth is. Yeah.
I'm sure the jokes have been flying. All right, well, let's move on to product, shall we? April, what is the big focus for you right now at Slack in terms of product? And as the company enters into coming on its 5th year, how has that process of innovating and iterating evolved?
Yeah, absolutely. So, so Slack's been in market for a little over 4 years. We've got 8 million daily active users, 70,000 paying customers. So, the last few years have been really phenomenal for us in that we have gone from 2 years ago, truly a team of more than a couple thousand people could not use Slack. We were not in a position to be able to support them, to being in a place now where we have customers with over 100,000 employees in a single Slack instance with Enterprise Grid that we launched last year. So, a big focus for us has really been expansion. This product launch, it caught fire, which I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about. But what happened was, increasingly the customers that wanted to use Slack looked less and less like us. And that can be an interesting moment for a product development-oriented company to figure out, okay, how do we, we built this for people that look like us, but now, IBM wants to use Slack. Now companies in other countries want to use Slack. Now companies that don't primarily do their work internally want to use Slack. And so over the last year with Enterprise Grid, with shared channels that work across companies, as well as our international launches, we're at a place where we're really expanding, and so we're running a similar playbook to what we used when we got started, but with a much more diverse audience.
Mm-hmm. And Shiva, you you made an interesting transition because your background, you held top product spots at YouTube, Spotify, and Apple, and your approach to product has been pixels, and now you're at a company where the product is real estate, space, then it's the community, the people that's in that space, and it's just a very different approach. So how do you take the traditional tech product approach and kind of layer it on top of a company like that?
So it's part of the reason that I was attracted to WeWork, actually, is to get a little bit closer to what are the other levers that you can pull when you're trying to affect community. So part of that is people, and part of that is bricks, not just pixels. So we can go in, we can understand effectively what's going on in a company that we're serving, and we're not just sitting there and saying, oh, let's change the software, which is very important, but we can have our community managers actually help effectively bring people along the way. And so what's different for me fundamentally is just the way we think of an engineering squad at WeWork is very different. So we might have community managers embedded in it. And you have basically people who design physical space embedded in that squad as well. So kind of changing the nature of how technology works. Teaching another group of people Agile is also very interesting, but putting those things together has been very exciting.
And how is technology going to change what we know as WeWork now?
There's a few different ways. One is, let's think about it on the supply side of WeWork. So we're actually deploying buildings at scale, and when you start to deploy 50 buildings a month, you have to start to think about repeatable patterns, what works, what doesn't work. So there's a lot of technology about just taking all this data that's been disparate, putting it effectively into a database and doing machine learning to learn what works. So that's one piece of it. And then you can go to the other side of it, which is think of these buildings like phones. They need an instrumentation layer. So we're spending time thinking about what is that building operating system and how do we put analytics on everything so we know how it's used. So once we have that foundation, then we can create apps on top of it, bringing people together, creating communities, but also we're very excited about things like lifestyle, wellness, et cetera. How can these apps sit on our OS? That's how we're looking at it.
April, and you guys, you were telling me you're getting into new things around Slack, like the ability to search and the ability to do more of the day-to-day workflow actually on Slack. Can you just briefly touch on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Slack is a collaboration hub, and at its most basic level, it's where people communicate. And they organize communication around channels, which is already a vastly better way of organizing, collaboration and team communication than predecessors like email. But one of the really critical things that has always been part of the vision for Slack is the extent to which it's a platform. So Slack is a place where teams that use Slack are plugged into. They basically are actively connected to Slack for over 10 hours a day, and they're actively using Slack for 2 hours and 40 minutes a day. So to some degree, we are the digital presence for your team, whereas WeWork is the physical presence for your team in many ways. And so, with that digital presence, it just becomes increasingly clear that for the just proliferation of software developers that are building increasingly specialized tools for teams at work, that it makes sense for them to bring that experience. Lightweight tasks, so notifications, approvals, documents that can be shared directly to the team that's working on them. And they should come into Slack and offer a rich enough experience that people can get their work done across this wide array of applications. And it's at a time when it really matters, because companies are licensing hundreds of different software applications these days, and now they'll be using tools like WeWork for their physical space as well. Just everything is being digitized and automated, but there's no place where it all comes together except for Slack.
And you guys are doing some collaborations together. But
Yep.
April, you touched on Slack's growth, which has been phenomenal, and it's a verb, and I can't reach the people that are closing this project today back at the office because I'm emailing them and they're not responding because they're on Slack. But at the same time, Microsoft has launched its Slack killer. There's like a few Slack killers out there. Microsoft launched Teams, Facebook launched Workplace. These are big companies.
Yeah.
And we've seen messaging platforms, there was a time when AOL Instant Messenger was really hot.
Yeah.
So tell me why, it's different for Slack.
Yeah.
And tell me also, how do you think about those new entrants to the market?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we're not surprised to see more entrants come into the space. I mean, the problem here is very real, so it's unsurprising that incumbents as well as new upstarts would want to go try to solve this problem, which is that as software has helped us do so many of the rote tasks of our job in a really, really simple fashion, and actually taken a lot of the energy in our, in our workday away from those tasks, it means that collaboration between people is like where the rubber meets the road. And so, so this is a very, very real need. And then when you layer on our platform vision and the fact that I believe companies will discover software for the workplace through Slack. There's no real distribution channel for software right now, and we have the opportunity to do that. It's unsurprising that people are coming into the space. But what do I think about it is that ultimately the responsibility comes back to my team. And we have found this position because we have worked really tirelessly around the product experience. We've got an amazing research team, design team. We really think about the end user and employee experience from all angles. And we work tirelessly at getting that right. And we've got to be reliable, and we've got to be easy to use. And if we do that, then we will continue to see what has driven us to this point, which is that employees ask to use Slack. It's very rarely that the CIO or the IT admin is the one saying, okay, we've made the decision, you're going to use Slack. It's instead employees are saying it, and in fact, when those competitors are brought in, employees say, no, we don't want to use those tools.
That's the best
endorsement. And we don't take that for granted.
Right.
That's very humbling, and we've got a lot of work to do to continue to earn that kind of fanaticism.
Yeah. We're going to go to questions in just a minute, but Shiva, I want to ask you, so WeWork is sort of like, it kind of strikes a chord in people when you ask about it, and I don't know if any other of these privately held companies has as wildly divergent opinions. Some people think it's going to be worth $1 billion tomorrow. Other people think it's incredibly overvalued. I'm not asking you to respond as the CEO, but how do you answer those critics from a product perspective?
From a product perspective, I stay focused on delivering value to the members, and I know that sounds fairly glib, but if you think about WeWork in a nutshell for me, it's largely that no one has taken this idea of space as a service and added an account management layer on top of it to understand what people need and give them that flexibility so they can grow over time. So what we're doing is bringing, like a lot of people in this room are SaaS experts, we look at that and we say, what can we do? What services matter for these people? Okay, they're about to grow 2 years from now. They're going to get their Series A or Series C and want to expand. Are we ready for them? So we spend most of our focus just saying, can we look at these very strategic enterprise accounts, create a roadmap for them, and that's what we spend most of our time talking about, to be honest.
Who's got a question for Shiva or April? Opening it up. Anybody out there? I see one in the back.
Yes, Michael Miller, PC Magazine. The title of the session is Productive Reinvention. And for the last couple of years, I've heard companies talk about how collaboration and community will help productivity. And there's been a lot of discussion, and you guys are out, and it all sounds great. But the productivity numbers, the productivity growth in this, well, anywhere in the world, have been, well, very disappointing for the last decade or so. What are you doing to change that?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, and it's a head scratcher that even though we have the best tools, our workforces have the best tools they've ever had, those productivity numbers don't reflect it. I think what that illustrates to me, the way I think about that, is there's still upside for opportunity. So while conversation and communication can happen in a more organized way today with the tools that we have, we've barely scratched the surface to be able to help companies harness that archive of conversation and workflows and decisions that happen within something like Slack, and be able to actually use those, not to use Slack better, like that's great for us, but actually to understand their business and their organization better. We believe that Slack reflects the explicit as well as the implicit organizational structure that helps your company run, and we have a lot of things that we have in mind for the future around how we're actually going to be able to provide that feedback back to our customers. I was sitting on the bus on the way here, and I overheard a conversation in the row behind me. These folks are here somewhere, and they were talking about how 90% of the conversation happening in Slack was in private channels, and how that was a concern for some people. And so I had to turn around, because we haven't launched this yet, but actually when we look at the data, it suggests that even though a lot of conversation happens in private channels so that the rest of the organization is not being distracted by it, actually a lot of the reading and a lot of the value is being created in that conversation that's happening in public channels. So there's so much that we have the potential to reveal about organization that I think is actually going to start to reap those rewards around productivity, and we're on our way.
Who has another question? Anybody out there? I certainly have more. All right, I'll pick up. Related to that, actually, talking about sort of our macroeconomic issues. How do you avoid, you guys are innovating and doing wonderful things, but how do you make sure you're not doing it in a bubble, and that you're not only designing for the upwardly mobile workforce, and that you're not only doing wonderful things for hipster millennials who have really good jobs? Like, how do you think about that? I mean, there's a lot of talk about this in AI and bias and inclusivity, but just in overall product innovation.
I think we're both forced to really face the entire spectrum of humanity as we do our jobs, right? Like in our case, we're in many different countries, very different cultures, different types of businesses that are trying to achieve, productivity, whatever it may be, and we have to help them. So we're forced to get out of Silicon Valley and that ethos that can sometimes lead you in the wrong direction. And so that, I think, is very important. The other side is large companies. So with us, we're starting to serve larger and larger Fortune 500 companies at the end of the day. And as you start to do that, you start to see people who, they're not having the discussion about what snacks are served at work right now. They're having a much larger discussion about how do I retain people, or how do I train people who they've actually started to leave behind because they're moving in a completely different direction with machine learning, for example. So we're starting to have those discussions, and it keeps it real for us.
Mm-hmm. April, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, it's already the case that we actually have, we have a lot of customers that don't look anything like the companies that are represented here at the conference. We've got a North Carolina grocery store where, you've actually got the folks that are on the ground, on the floor in the grocery store are using Slack. And so, there are those retail use cases that get into service in some of those areas. And I think that we could do more to serve them. And I think that's a really good example of kind of the first thing we talked about, which is like, the practice of product development and actually understanding users that look nothing like the employees that sit inside your building, like it's totally achievable, and it's a thing that is very possible to do well. You just have to commit yourself to it.
Mm-hmm.
How do you guys, both of your companies have raised lots and lots and lots of money, and you're competing sometimes with companies that are not in that situation. You have the luxury of sort of being able to throw anything against the wall, really invest in product development. again, take luxuries that companies that are, have to focus on ROI or have a shorter time frame aren't able to do. Do you think that that ever fuels sort of indulgent innovation? And I don't know. What would you say to somebody who said that?
I mean, I'll say we have raised a fair amount of money, and money's good because it's optionality. But actually, we're up against the biggest tech players in the world. So I actually don't think of that as some competitive advantage for us, that we have the money sitting in the bank. We've always taken the approach that we need to be incredibly focused, because it's been clear to us that if we are successful in our mission, we would be competing against the Microsofts and those other large companies, and that's what's happened. And they actually have a lot of advantages that we don't have. So we have no inclination towards frivolous development.
Yeah, we have to keep it very lean, right, and solve material
meat.
problems.
Not even
right?
any meat.
Yeah, exactly. Not even any meat. And part of that is, I think it's just better, right? Because at the end of the day, is that I love plant-based meat. Plug, yeah.
Plant-based meat, right?
Yeah, but one of the things we have to do is remember, that money, is other people's money, and we have to see a return on it. We generally have to have a culture where people appreciate that, every dime matters. But I think that's also important for product development, because what we're trying to do is prove these hypotheses with the minimum amount of investment, but the maximum amount of bets. So you really want to maximize your portfolio and see what works or what doesn't work, and that means staying lean at the end of the day. If you get too bloated, you cut off half of those opportunities. And particularly in our industry, it's a long timeline to seeing results. So the more you can seed now, the better.
Great. Well, thanks so much for being with us for this great conversation, and hope we see more collaboration between the two of you.
Thank you.